Hey guys, welcome back to another video. I know it's been good few weeks actually, maybe even a couple of months, but life's been busy and the weather hasn't really been cooperating here in the Bay Area. But nevertheless, we'll be having a look at another Audi here today. Obviously, clearly not this beautiful B3 Series 8090 Audi, but a is it 3 or 4 generations? I'm not sure. Maybe it's 4 generations. The great grandchild of that particular car, what is known commonly as the B8 Audi S4, the B8 generation. This is again my own car. This is actually 7 years old, close to 7 years old. So as I go through the detailed overview, you will see some small nicks and paint chips and whatnot. That's because this car has been daily driven, at least for the first 3 to 4 years. So yeah, once again, I'll be going over the inner working details of the car, the external features, the design, talking about the engine, the upkeep, which is actually surprisingly low, and other general details of driving an owning 2011-2012 B8 Audi S4. So yeah, catch you in a bit. Alright guys, so let's get started with the review. And again, to make sure that I reiterate what I've already said a couple of times, this is a 7-year-old car. This is not a brand new car. I got a lot of comments in some of the previous videos talking about how the cars weren't clean enough. I don't know what that means. They were actually pretty clean when I reviewed the video. But given the age of this car and the fact that, as I mentioned, this has not been babied, it's actually been daily driven on multiple road trips, on your day-to-day commute and whatnot. There are some rock chips up front. There are some small minor dings in the back. I'll walk you through them, so please keep that in mind. And again, to reiterate, these are all videos that I'm doing just because it's fun, not because these are supposed to be high production value videos. If you want such kind of videos, you should probably be looking at some other channel. So with that, let's get started with the review of the 2012 model year 2012 B8 Audi S4. Okay, so let's get started with the external review first. Um, this is a fairly well-known car at this point, in that I'm sure you've, if not the S4 itself, I'm sure you've seen a crap ton of the A4s of this generation. We never got the RS4 for the B8 generation. We only got the S4 and the A4 and the RS5, which is essentially the same car but on the coupe and convertible body style. So yes, I personally feel, and again this is just my opinion, you can agree or disagree with it, but I personally feel that the B8 generation A4, S4, and in fact this era of Audis in general are some of the best looking, rather most proportionate and understated cars on the road. The previous generation, the B7 and the B6, the B7 was essentially a warmed over B6, were very good looking cars, again classically Audi, understated but a little bit anonymous. And I feel like the one that came after this, which was the B8.5, I am not a big fan, because the 8.5 clearly looks like a very sort of forced midlife update, so to speak. The B9 generation, which is what the all-road that I have that I did a review of, is better looking in that it seems like a much more focused design language. But again, as I said, I personally feel that the B8 generation of the A4 and S4 is one of the best. In fact, I put it right up there with the E39 5 Series as one of the best looking sedans, modern sedans on the road. So yes, so this was also one of the first quote-unquote mainstream Audis to actually make use of LED lights. I'll give you a little on the corner, a little shot of the light, but the daytime running lights are LED. The main beam is halogen, and the indicator lights are obviously regular bulbs. So yes, it has the first gen dotted look to the LED lights versus the continuous strip that you see in some cars these days, or rather most cars these days. I know a lot of people don't necessarily like the individual LED look. I for one feel that at least on the S4 and the A4 of this generation, it looks nice. It looks like eyebrows, but obviously at the bottom. But again, to each their own. So at the bottom you have the fog light, the traditional fog light. There is no air intake over here. At the center you obviously see the Audi S4 logo with the bit bold Audi logo itself. I have swapped out this middle bar. The one that comes by default with this car, at least for the North American market, or United States rather, was the same sort of shade of grey as this, versus satin black, and it had the holes and the placement there for the front number plate, which looks again in all Audis bog hideous. So that was one of the first, and in fact frankly the only modification that I've done on this car. Swap that out. I don't know if you can see it clearly through this, but then at the bottom over there is the so right at the bottom there, you can see right at the grill is the supercharger intercooler or radiator, and I've also made sure to put a guard of sorts there. I don't know, oh, there you go, you can see it much better. Sort of grill, that's again an OEM grill. For some reason the cars that were shipped to the North American market never made it with that mesh grill, and as a result rocks and pebbles and other debris would hit the supercharger radiator directly, causing damage. So it's a cheap and easy fix. Again, there are OEM parts, and why Audi decided to skimp out on this 50-cent part for the North American market, I don't know, but there is that. On this side we do have an intake. I don't know if it's clearly visible over here in the shot, maybe it's not, but there you go. So there is an intercooler, oh sorry, there is an intake here for the radiator behind the grill. So yeah, the front end, as I mentioned, is a very classically pretty looking vehicle, very understated, a lot of nice details in typical Audi fashion. Moving on to the wheels, I did not get the 19-inch wheels. I got the base 18-inch wheels with this car. In fact, yeah, so about this car, this is a premium plus, not a prestige. So, and I did not get the 19-inch wheels. In fact, that was the only regret that I had with this car. As you may have already seen in the configuration, it's a fairly base spec, and that was intentional because I bought this car as a driver's vehicle and it was my first new car, so I was more constrained on the budget piece. But the 5-arm rotor wheel that you get, the optional, is I feel it looks beautiful, the two-tone, and that is the only regret that I have. But apart from that, I'm really happy with this car. So yes, so I'm not sure if you can clearly see it over here. You see the little S4 logo on the brake caliper, just the front. These are very pretty looking wheels, I feel. And in fact, the one thing that I will say is that the 18-inch cars equipped with the 18-inch tires have a better ride than cars with the 19-inch tires. The 19-inch versions I feel are a bit crashier, but yeah, make what of that you will. And this this is the controversial logo, the supercharged logo. So the car by default comes with the V6T logo. I'm assuming, or I think, if I'm based on what I can read, the T was supposed to, I think in German, it signifies forced induction, not supercharged or turbocharged necessarily. But either way, this is not Germany, this is America, and the V60 gives it the impression that it's a V6 turbocharged engine, and a lot of people used to ask me that when I bought this car initially. Given that the A6 for some reason comes with the supercharged OEM logo, I just swapped that out and I feel that this looks much better. So yeah, there is that. Then moving to the side profile of this car, very clean lines. You have one character line over here that runs the length of the car, and then you have this really strong crease that's at the bottom. But apart from that, fairly simple, very flowing design. In typical S fashion, you get the satin brushed metal finish over here. Unlike in the B7 and older generation, this is not actually metal, this is plastic, cross cutting I guess, but it does look really pretty. I think if you end up getting the, I don't remember if it's a black optics package or some other package, this ends up becoming body colored, which I feel, again, to each their own, but I feel that takes away from the quintessential, you know, S and RS-ness of an Audi. So yeah, there is that. This car does not come with the, even though there is a little cutout over there, it doesn't come with the keyless entry option. I did not choose that particular feature. As I said, fairly simple and straightforward car, spec rather. Moving up to the back, once again, I like the look. Similar to the LED lights in the front, there are individual LEDs that you can see through the cluster. Again, I'll have a little cutout video at the bottom right corner that shows the light blinking and turned on in better light settings. But nevertheless, it's a very proportionate car on the back. Nothing too fancy, not too much flair, but it looks very nice. Right at the bottom, you have twin exhausts on each side. There is one here and there's one set over here. You have this little Ford diffuser valance over here. As I mentioned, this is a used car in the sense that I have used it for 7 years. You can see this little scuff that came from the handful of times I've taken this car to SF, and that was my lesson that I learned, never to street park a car like this in San Francisco City. So yeah, again, as I said, I personally feel this is one of the best looking sedans, woefully underrated and underappreciated, but it is what it is, and I feel like looking at this car 7 years hence, it still looks very modern, so to speak, right? It keeps up with the times. And I feel like this is one of those designs, unlike some of the newer Audis with their very sharp angular looks, is something that has aged and will continue to age really well. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Alright, moving on to the good stuff. So unlike the S5 sibling, at least for the first couple of years it was sold in North America with the option of the 4.2 liter naturally aspirated V8, and then moved on to the supercharged 3 liter V6, the S4, at least for North America, only ever came with the 3 liter supercharged V6, and it's a beautiful engine. Let me be very honest here. Again, it's woefully underappreciated, very smooth, very linear engine. I know a lot of people with the modern turbocharged vehicles talk about how modern turbocharging technology has eliminated lag and given a much more linear power feel, and that is true. I have an RS3, I have the all-road with the turbocharged 4-cylinder 2-liter engine, and all of that is true in that a modern turbocharged engine, whether it is 4-pot or 6-pot or 8-pot, is miles ahead of what was available even, let's say, a decade ago. But until you've driven a vehicle with a supercharged engine, you don't really fully understand what linear power delivery means. And as I said, gem of an engine. Something that, again, not fully appreciated. So yes, so this car was available only with the V6 3-liter supercharged engine, paired either with the 7-speed dual clutch or the 6-speed manual. This is a 6-speed manual version. In fact, even when I bought this car in 2011, finding a manual transmission version of this car was super rare. In fact, I couldn't find at least the spec that I wanted on any lots here in the West Coast. So similar to the all-road and similar to the RS3 that I have, I had to custom order this car and wait a good 3 months, because again, as I said, there were no manual transmission equipped cars on dealer lots. So this car has roughly about 40,000 miles on it. I know it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but that is because after the first 3 or 4 years, once we got the all-road and the RS3, it wasn't driven as much. But for the first 3 or 4 years, believe me when I say this, this was my everyday car, and we've gone on multiple road trips with this. So yeah, thus far, this engine has been bulletproof. Now, at least this for my particular car. There are a couple of gotchas which you need to keep in mind if you are planning on either buying a used S4 of this generation, or in general if you have one and you're thinking about upkeep and whatnot. I think, if I'm not mistaken, for the first 2 model years, that was 2009 and I think 2010, the water pump in these, the impellers were made from plastic and they were known to go bust. I know Audi either proactively or reactively started swapping them out on a bunch of cars, but anyway, something to keep in mind if you're especially looking at the very early generation B8 S4s. The other thing is that the DSG, right, as with any dual clutch transmission, at least from the Volkswagen group, there is higher maintenance involved, and because of the inherently higher complexity versus the manual transmission car. So that is something to keep in mind. You will hear and read about DSG mechatronic unit malfunction stories, so something to keep in mind. And finally, the thermostat is something that tends to, again, it's not a regular item, but it is something that tends to go out after a couple of years or many tens of thousands of miles. There was a recall for the fuel lines on this car, I think last year or the year before, and I actually asked the dealership to proactively, because the thermostat is somewhere in between here, beneath the supercharger, and they were pulling all of that anyway to get to the fuel lines. I actually asked them to proactively swap out the thermostat. So yes, something to keep in mind. But apart from that, the only one other issue, is carbon buildup, which is actually true for almost any direct injected car, especially some of the earlier ones, unlike the newer ones which have port and direct injection to kind of sort of, get across that issue. But that is something to keep in mind, especially if the S4 has been driven for fairly short distances over and over again, and the driver or the user has not kept up with the oil changes or proactively changed oil more often. That is, carbon buildup is something to keep in mind. But yes, so again, a very nice engine. If you get a chance to drive one of these cars, you should. It's very nice. It's not overly powerful. In fact, I feel it's very well matched for the chassis and whatnot. But yeah, so that's the engine and the powertrain. All right, let's get started off with the interior, and let's start off with the door first, obviously, because it makes sense. So a little bit of a funny backstory. When I was looking to buy a new car, which was about 7 years ago or so, my first new car, I had a used car before that. I actually, it's the interior of the S4 that actually sold me on this car, because I was looking to go get a CPO C63 AMG or a CPO M3, and I was absolutely sold on the AMG. I loved that car, the 6.2 liter V8 NA. That thing was mind-blowing. However, the first and only time I actually sat in one of them and I drove around, I think it was a CPO 2010 car. And by the way, just as an FYI, at that time I used to own a Mark 5 Jetta, which had for a mainstream vehicle, had a surprisingly well-built interior, well put together interior. So when I test drove the C63 AMG, and this is pre-facelift 2010, I was appalled at the quality of the plastics, at the design. It just For a car that brand new was north of $70,000, the interior just put me off completely. I then drove the M3, which I liked a lot, again CPO, but I don't know how many of you viewers are from the Bay Area, but you'll agree with me when I say that there are a crap ton of M3s on the road here. So it was a colleague of mine who ended up getting a brand new B8 S4 in a Sepang blue, and he gave me the opportunity to drive the car around the parking lot, and I was blown away because it had all the usable performance that I needed with a much better put together interior. So anyway, coming back to the main topic, the quality of the interior. So yes, starting off from the top, nice soft touch plastic over here, and I have to say that this quality of plastic is much better than well, I wouldn't say much better, I take that back. It is better than what I see in the B9 generation of the A4 and S4 and whatnot. So yes, and then coming down here you see this brushed aluminum. This is real aluminum, brushed aluminum. Let me see if I can show you the texture. There you go, really nice finish. You had the option of swapping these parts out with these trim pieces out with carbon fiber. Real do that. And you have a satin finish metal look door handle with the lock unlock buttons. And here, since as you can see, I went with the optional red magma leather Napa leather package. I absolutely love this, the quality of this leather. In fact, it's because of this car I've been spoiled in terms of how I judge and gauge the quality of leather in other cars, including my all-road, which is, if you've seen the video, I don't like the leather in that. So yeah, nice magma red real Napa leather. You have this leatherette armrest over here with the memory seat controls, the power window controls, the lock unlock for the rear power windows, the mirror control. And by the way, for some reason, I don't know if this is true for the Prestige trim also, but at least on the Premium Plus, which is what this is, despite it having the memory function and the memory seats, which I'll get to in a bit, for some reason the power tilting right mirror is not enabled. So you actually need to go into VACCOM. It's a simple trick. You just need to go into your VACCOM VCDS. I don't remember exactly which subsection, but page, flip a bit, and you have that functionality enabled. So yeah, and right below that you obviously have the switch for the releasing the boot. You have a nice little cup holder here, and once again, this is hard plastic, definitely compared to up top, but I have to say that this hard plastic is of much better quality than what you see in the current generation B9 generation, A4, S4, etc, etc. Something to keep in mind. So this car also has the optional Bang & Olufsen sound system, and there's a tweeter up there, as you can see. Again, as I mentioned in both the RS3 as well as the all-road reviews, if you listen to anything more than podcasts and FM radio, I highly recommend the Bang & Olufsen options for Audi cars. It makes a big difference. It's actually criminal that the base quality stereo sounds as bad as it does. Moving into the rest of the interior, again, very well put together overall. I'll give a detailed look in a little bit, but once again, I feel like this combination of magma red and black looks really good. And another thing to note is that, again, this is a 7-year-old car with close to 40,000 miles, almost daily driven. Well, definitely daily driven the first 3 to 4 years. Look at how the leather has actually kept up. Now, I have done at least a half decent job of trying to maintain the leather, in that at least every 6 months or so, I tend to condition and clean the leather. But still, I'm not saying you don't see wear, especially on this bolster over here. You can see some wear. But imagine, this is a 7-year-old car which has been put to pretty good use, including multiple road trips and whatnot. And the leather has held up exceptionally well. So once again, it's when I compare the quality of the seats and leather in this car to the B9 generation all-road, that is when I feel disappointed, in that Audi seems to have cut a lot more corners on the B9 generation than they had on the B8. So yeah. Alright, starting off with a detailed look of the interior with the center console. So the first big thing that you'll see over here, I don't know if I remember mentioning this earlier in the video, this is a fairly sparsely spec'd car, and that was intentionally so. I did not go with the optional MMI package. So the display that you see over there up top is not the MMI screen. It doesn't, I mean, it is the MMI screen, but it doesn't have navigation built in, and it is of a smaller size and lower resolution than what you would find if this car were equipped with the MMI screen. What also changes if you buy a car with with the MMI package is that center screen that you see over there between the speedometer and the tachometer, that is on the current car that I have right now, as you can see over there. It is an old school red colored dot matrix LED. That is the one piece of equipment in the car that gives the age of this car away. That looks so old school and out of place. I don't know what to say. And in fact, I did not know, the sales associate did not tell me that the center screen would be an old LED screen versus a full color screen if you went with the MMI package. So something to keep in mind. It's not just the fact that you don't get navigation. That center screen also looks really old and dated if you don't get the MMI package. Then the steering wheel is fairly straightforward. As you can see over here, the pattern in the middle is reminiscent of the single frame grille up front, and that's a design theme that Audi still continues to this date. On the steering wheel, you'll see very basic controls. You'll see the option to turn on the voice dialing system. Again, you can't control any other feature in the car. That's basically just for voice dialing and whatnot. The volume up down, you don't even have a track forward backward over there. On the other side, you see the ability to switch modes. When you hit the mode button, you cycle through various functions in that middle LED display. And then the scroll wheel next to it lets you scroll up and down depending on whatever it is that you're, whichever function page that you're on. On the back over there, you see the stock for the headlight and the turn signals. This car does not have the automatic headlights. I don't know if you can see it clearly over here, but there's a stock at the bottom, a separate stock right over there, which actually is the cruise control stock. Again, this car does not have adaptive cruise control. It's straightforward cruise control, but I love the fact that unlike a couple of other Audis and Volkswagens, this car has a separate cruise control stock. I personally love that feature. And on the right side, you see the stock for the wiper. Again, fairly simple. This car does have a rain sensor, and therefore you have a mode for auto, which is right above off. And actually, that's the other thing I want to mention. I don't know if it's calibration or the kind of sensor that they use, but I feel like the one in this generation of Audis is much less aggressive in terms of changing the wiper speed to the amount of rain that's falling versus the current generation B9s, which for some reason start speeding up the wiper even for light showers or drizzles. So yeah, again, an interesting observation over there. Now, given that this is the S4 and not the RS4, it does not get the flat bottom steering wheel. I know that seems to be a very popular, if you look at the forums, it seems to be a fairly popular upgrade, but this is again bone stock. It has nice leather stitching on both the steering wheels as well as on the gear lever boot to match the red of leather of the seats. So yeah, and the other difference is you'll see that the MMI control or the infotainment screen control is actually in the center stack. That's a dead giveaway as to whether the car has MMI or not, because if this car had the MMI package, that center control stack over there would actually be at the bottom right here, not up near the center console. So that is something that is the key visual differentiator to see whether the car has the MMI package or not. Again, fairly standard and straightforward Audi HVAC and whatnot controls. At the bottom, you have the two climate zones, independent climate zones. The car does come with equipped with heated seats. It does not come with ventilated seats or massaging seats. That is something that only the B9 generation on S4 gets even as an option. And then obviously right below that you have the glorious 6-speed stick Again, this is a car that's equipped. I actually explicitly went for this car, interior quality aside, because of the fact that it comes with a stick shift. The gear is it's interesting. It's very mixed in that I personally like the quality of the gear shift, in that it's not too long a throw, it's not too short a throw, especially for daily commute and whatnot. That being said, it does feel a little notchy, especially when it's a little cold, the temperature, going from first to second to third. Once it warms up, I feel that the shift action is very good, especially when paired with the clutch. The clutch action is light without being overtly light, but it's also not like a how do I put this, previous generation Porsche clutch. I don't know if a lot of you have driven some of the 997 era Porsche cars. They tend to have the manual versions, obviously. They tend to have it's a nice clutch, but it tends to be a little bit on the heavier side, so something to keep in mind. On the left, you see the electromechanical parking brake. Once again, North America did not get the auto brake hold over there. And way in the back over here, you see a couple of blank buttons, but at the center is the button to turn on and off the stability control. And since this is an S car, holding down that button for 5 seconds will fully defeat the stability control. If that is something to keep in mind if you didn't know. So for the rest of the dash, again, so what you see up there, the silver look finish, that's actually all plastic. That's not real aluminum or real metal. On the other hand, along with the door panels that you see over there, the metal piece trim that you see in the center, that's real aluminum, the same brushed aluminum. Again, if you go for the carbon fiber package, that is swapped out with carbon fiber. So something to keep in mind. I guess that's really it. Oh, the other thing that I do want to talk about is the infotainment system, which I'll dive into in a little bit. Okay, so moving on to the infotainment system in this car, it is the one thing in this car that pisses me off the most, because this was the era in which Audi had this, I don't know if you guys can see it in the video, but it had this thing called the Audi Music Interface. Essentially, it was this proprietary port. Let me see if I can pull this out. Right. After fiddling and struggling around with that a bit, so there you go. So that's the proprietary AMI port. So what that means and implies is that this car does not come or did not come with an auxiliary 3.5 mm jack, a USB port, or an iPod adapter of any sort. You had to buy different. Let me show you this over here. You had to buy different cables, with one end being this sort of proprietary AMI connector, and the other in this case is an iPod 30-pin connector. But you could get it in USB male, USB female, 3.5 mm, etc, etc. And so every time you wanted to use a different device, you had to buy each one of these separate cables and then open the glove box, open this little port over here, plug the damn. It was a pain. Right? It was expensive, it was painful, and the really funny bit is that even though this car came with Bluetooth support, the Bluetooth was enabled only for making and receiving phone calls. You could not stream audio with the car. I don't know if this was the case also with the MMI equipped cars, but certainly for the non-MMI cars, even though the car had a Bluetooth module, it had no A2DP protocol support, because of which it could not stream audio. So I tried a lot of different third-party solutions. Some worked, some didn't work, and even the ones that worked, it was very finicky, until I finally settled upon this guy here. It's a tune-to-air adapter. I don't know if this is still available. I remember purchasing this good 5 or so years ago from Amazon. So essentially what this does is, on the one end, it has an old school 30-pin iPod connector, and it's essentially a Bluetooth dongle, so to speak, wherein once you plug this in and then you plug the other end into the AMI port, if you cycle through the media button over there, it actually shows a little iPod icon on the screen, and that's how you can stream Bluetooth audio. So it's still a compromise solution, because while you can control the playback using the controls over here, you don't see on-screen information about the track that's being played, and etc, etc. It's just, again, it works, but it's sad that a car that cost over $50,000 in 2011 2012 didn't have working Bluetooth streaming support out of the box, but it is what it is. So yeah. All right, to wrap up the interior, let's look at the rear. So let's move to the seats. So again, as I mentioned in, I think, the all-road video, we have two golden retrievers. So I purchased this Kurgo sort of mat of sorts, which basically slides into the window sill, so to speak, so that doggy fur and drool and hair and all that stuff doesn't get into the side panels, door panels. So the rear door panel is very similar to the same, wherein you have soft touch plastics on the top with the brushed aluminum trim there, and the soft Napa leather in between, with the hard plastic at the bottom, and the Bang & Olufsen speakers and tweeter up over there. Nothing particularly extraordinary. In terms of the interior, again, given the size of the transmission tunnel in between, especially because of the quattro all-wheel drive setup, even though theoretically you can flip this over and have a kid or a small adult sit in center, given the raised nature of the center seat and that transmission tunnel in between, I would say that for anything but extremely short trips, this is probably a four-seater for all practical purposes. Something to keep in mind. You have the armrest console over here, again covered in Napa leather, soft, supple Napa leather, fine grain. And up over here you have the cup holder, dual cups. You can push it back in. You have the ski pass-through that's lockable on this side. Again, typical of Volkswagen and Audi cars, nothing new over there. So the center console in the rear, you will actually see temperature control as well as the intensity control. Now they say it's 3-zone, but from what I know of the way this works, I don't really think they have a separate compressor for this. I think it just, depending on what you've set over here, it just basically averages out whatever has been set across the front two zones. So you get anywhere from mildly warm to mildly cold air. Unless of course both the front zones have been set to hot or cold. But yeah, and then at the bottom you have a little 12 volt power port. I've plugged in this charger over there, but that's it. Fairly basic, fairly simple, fairly straightforward. And then to wrap it off, let me try and sit over here. So this is a thing that I find a little surprising about the B8 generation, in that if you look at the exterior dimensions, it's a sizable mid-size car. The wheelbase is also fairly long, but then so I'm about 5 feet 11, and with the front seat set to my height, you can see that there is about maybe I don't know, 2 point something inches between the back of the front seats and my knee. So if your front driver, the driver is, let's say, 6 feet or over 6 feet, this is going to be a fairly tight fit. It's not uncomfortable in that I am sitting fairly comfortably over here, but it's surprising given the overall length of the car that it doesn't show as well in the rear legroom department. You have a little mesh net over here for storing things, but that is what it is. So yeah, oh yeah, and this car has the sunroof. There was no option of a panoramic sunroof, although unlike the fabric sunscreen that you get in some of the modern Audis, this is the real deal. It's a proper piece of cardboard or plastic or whatever it is. And then you have the overhead console with the, hallelujah, HomeLink control over there. Non-LED overhead lights. And you have the sunroof control right in between over there. The mirrors, rear mirrors, are auto dimming. It has a little compass up top that you can see. The side mirrors are also auto dimming. I find that to be a very useful feature. But I think with that we have wrapped the interior. If you guys have any specific questions, let me know and I'll try and answer them in the comment section. Alright, so with that, let's get started with the final portion of the video, which is the actual drive. And as I mentioned, this is a very fun car to drive. It's very tractable, and what I mean by that is that the everything from the nature of the engine to, as I mentioned, the gear shift quality and the actual powertrain and whatnot, they are all very tractable in the sense that they work very well for everyday day-to-day commute driving and whatnot, as well as when you really want to sort of like hit it at 100% throttle and drive very aggressively. It works really well for either way, right? So right now, as you can see, I'm ambling around. Given the ample amount of torque, that is 325 pound-feet of torque that this car has, it's very possible for you to actually drive around at 6th gear at 30 something 40 something miles per hour. Obviously it's not something that you should do all the time. It bogs down the engine, but again, it's just testament to the fact that this car is very drivable. It has a lot of available torque and power across its range, and that's a nice character to have. It's not peaky, so to speak, right? So now, before I get to the actual driving experience, there are a couple of drawbacks with this particular car, right? One is the fact that, again, those who own this car would know this. It's almost a little too muted. Seriously, I mean, I'm not saying that this is an RS car that needs to have a loud exhaust and basically pop and fart every time you go down a gear, but this is way too muted. And in fact, that is the reason why one of the popular sort of upgrades, aftermarket upgrades for an S4 of this generation is typically to do an aftermarket exhaust. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, even Audi recognized this, which is why with the B8.5 generation, especially if you get the version with the DSG, it actually does have a little, again, nowhere near as the RS5 cars or the RS3 cars, but it does have a little pop, bang, crackle, or as they call the DSG fart when you downshift. But that is something to keep in mind. Likewise, I'll get to the interstate and I'll show you the, or I'll have you hear the sound. I don't know if the microphone on this GoPro can pick it up. The supercharger whine is a little too subdued, right? It would be great if out of the factory this came with a little bit more oomph in the audio department. It's almost too quiet on the inside of this car. It doesn't jive with the fact that this is supposed to be the performance version. I know it's not the RS version, but still the performance version of the A4 range, right? So, and I think the supercharger whine can actually be solved with a fairly simple air filter swap. I think people also end up using a different pulley to get you not just more power but a more audible whine. But as I said, fairly simple, but this car is bone stock. I have not modified anything in this car. So what you see is essentially what you get. So yeah, there you go. In-gear acceleration in this car, I don't know if you can hear the whine, but the in-gear acceleration in this car is phenomenal. As I said earlier, until and unless you actually drive a car with a supercharged engine, you don't realize what linear power delivery means. I have driven cars with twin turbos, and yes, they are obviously much better than a single turbocharged vehicle, and modern turbochargers are obviously much more refined and better tuned than turbochargers of the past. But as I mentioned, a supercharger is a supercharger, and it is kind of sad to see the fact that this engine or this configuration is dying. Right, I think apart from Ford and a handful of other manufacturers, domestic manufacturers, I think Dodge is another one, the supercharger configuration has fallen out of favor, which is truly sad. Now, this particular engine is actually found across a variety of Volkswagen Group products, as is to be expected. The A6 of this generation had the, you can get the optional, this engine as an option, but it is slightly detuned. Instead of the 333 horsepower that you get in this particular car, I think that version comes as 310 horsepower. I know that the Q7 also had this engine available as an option, although I think in the Q7 you got the full 333 horsepower. Funnily enough, I think even some of the Cayennes had this engine, but funnily enough, the rarest car, in fact, to have this particular engine would be the Touareg Hybrid. Yes, So the 2RX Hybrid was actually a sleeper, an absolute sleeper, because not only did it have the hybrid powertrain to sort of kick in when at lower RPMs and give you that sort of seamless near electric car feel, it actually had the V6 supercharged engine from the S4 underneath the hood. I got the chance to drive the 2RX Hybrid exactly once, and that car, surprisingly, given its weight and size and whatnot, was surprisingly fun to drive. So again, in addition to the fact it's a true unicorn, that car is actually a lot of fun. So that also goes to show that this is a very versatile engine, right? Let me downshift, for example, right now, and there you go. Super linear power delivery, very good in gear acceleration. It feels like a very confident car. That's how I would actually use, that's the word I would use to describe the way it feels to drive this car. Unlike the RS3, actually, in fact, let me answer that question right now, because someone asked me about this in the comment section earlier. Unlike the RS3, which is decidedly more high-strung, the S4 is much more confident in what it can and cannot do, and therefore I feel like this feels more relaxing. Even though it's not necessarily slower, it's very capable, but it feels much more relaxing in its drive than, let's say, something like an RS3, which even in comfort mode kind of sort of seems to be on the edge more often than not, right? Which again is sort of, given the fact that it's an RS car versus an S car, that seems almost obvious. I know a lot of you will be going duh, but just to sort of reiterate, right, this is a better daily driver than the RS3 or the previous generation RS5 that I've driven, which had surprisingly less torque than this car. I think it was 317 pound-foot of torque versus 325 in this. So moving away from the drivetrain and the powertrain, the rest of the chassis, very compliant chassis. So this car comes with the 40-60 split permanent quattro, the mechanical torsion diff quattro, none of the funny stuff. I do not have the rear sport differential. As I mentioned, I made sure to get this car at the bare basic spec because that's how I wanted it. So it doesn't have the crown differential for the rear, but then it has a permanent or semi-permanent 40-60 split, and I think it can push up to 70 or 80 something of the torque to the back if needed. So this is another thing that I want to talk about. I know that a lot of folks, again, internet armchair experts and folks who haven't actually driven an S4 or Audis of this generation are going to default to the opinion that, oh my god, these are nose heavy cars, they are no fun to drive, etc, etc. And it is sad that people say that, in that, yes, I agree that this doesn't have perfect 50-50 weight distribution the way a BMW does. I'll give you that. I am not going to argue against it. But then, given everything that Audi has tried to do with the placement of the engine, the longitudinal engine, as well as the weight, the power distribution and the rear differential, I have driven an S4 with the rear differential and it feels fun. You can clearly feel the rear kick in, especially when you try and take interstate exits and on ramps aggressively. You can clearly feel the rear bias, and that is something great, and that is actually what I want. I don't want the rear end to go back and forth every time I step on the accelerator. As much fun as that is in a lot of videos and whatnot, you don't want that in daily drives. And the quattro system that is there in this car, the mechanical quattro system, is it serves the purpose really well, in that it is engaging and fun without being always on the edge. Then moving on to the suspension and whatnot, I don't have the drive select option over here with the adaptive dampers. So my steering wheel, the suspension, etc. are not variable. It is what you see is what you get. And I actually kind of like that, not just for its simplicity, but also for the fact that this means that the car manufacturer has to actually put in some effort to make sure that they dial the suspension in, they dial the steering in, they dial the throttle response in, because they can't just fall back on, oh, I'm going to give 3 different options varying from really slow response to absolute batshit crazy super hard suspension. Let the user decide what they want to do, right? With this, there is no option. So Audi had to make sure that the car works and runs and feels good out of the box. and I think they've done a very, very good job. Now, I'm not saying that the ride is luxurious. It's not. It is a little bit on the harder side, but it's very, very compliant without being crashy. So, to give you another example, on the RS3, when I set it to dynamic, which is again absolute batshit crazy mode, you cannot daily drive that car on at least Bay Area roads. It's just too much. It takes a toll on you, and you know that it's not good for the car either, because you'll start getting rattles and shakes all over the car. Whereas with this, with the default suspension, it does a good job of providing you the right amount of feedback and support without sort of, again, being too crashy, being too harsh. So I feel like overall the stock suspension, even if you end up getting a car without the drive select feature, is actually not bad at all. It is very, very good. As mentioned earlier, the 18-inch tires are more forgiving than the 19-inch tires. Something to keep in mind when you decide, if and when you decide to buy one of these cars. But as I said, very, very compliant ride, very, very tractable powertrain and drivetrain, and even in terms of long-term upkeep, as I mentioned, outside of the $800 something that I paid for the Audi Care when I bought the car, I haven't spent a dime on actual maintenance. As I said, exactly once I did have the dealer proactively change the thermostat, but given that there was a recall and they already had to go in to get a bunch of the stuff out, they didn't charge me labor for it. It was just the part. But apart from that, nothing at all in the car, interior or exterior. It's actually been bulletproof. As I mentioned, the car has not been babied. It has actually been used extensively for daily commuting as well as road trips and whatnot. So essentially, to wrap it up, as I mentioned, it's a great car. There you go. There is a B9 A4 right there. It's a great car, woefully underappreciated. But if you own one, you already know this. But if you're planning on buying one, as I said, do your due diligence. It's as with buying any new used car, that goes without saying. But then assuming you get a car that has been maintained well and has not been abused, you're getting a fairly reliable car. You're getting a fairly well-performing car. In fact, I would say it's almost all the performance that you need for daily driving minus tracking, etc., etc. It's a reasonably spacious car for a family. I have a friend who actually has the exact same car in a DSG configuration, who has a kid. The baby seats fit perfectly fine out back over there. As I've mentioned, I've carried dogs, 2 golden retrievers in the rear seat with a hammock in place. No issues whatsoever. So given that it's not a wagon, for a sedan it's fairly versatile. The one downside, as I said, is on the tech department. It's fairly lacking. That is where this car shows its age the most, but it is what it is. If you do get a car with the MMI, I think some of the shortcomings are taken care of, but now the navigation looks really dated. So it's again a compromise that you have to make. But yeah, overall it's a great car. I would definitely recommend that if you see one in good condition, that you buy it, if this is the car that you want. And let me know if you have any other questions, concerns, feedback in the comment section below, and I'll catch you guys in another video.